Hey everyone, welcome to a new video game review. I have not done one of these in years. Last one I did was on the Infamous games.
I personally think they were probably the best games on the PlayStation 3 system. They are the Infamous games.
Don't watch that. Anyway, today we're going to take a look at Jak 3, The Journey Back, the final game in the Jak and Daxter trilogy. This was developed by a different developer from Naughty Dog, but as Daxter showed us, this isn't always a bad thing. The game was developed by The Mercenary, and was mostly a solo project with seemingly little to no budget. The game started development in 2004 and was released in 2005 for the PC. It did have some trouble development, they only had just over a year to complete it, and in the words of The Mercenary, the game was overall a pain in the ass to make. Later that year, there was a new version of the game released titled the Gold Edition, which is the version I will be reviewing. This version updated some of the graphics and is overall a better quality experience. This is a very short game, so I'll be going over most of its content. So let's dive right into it. Let's start with the story. Now, the game itself doesn't really start with any story. It opens with some text outlining how the game opens, but no cinematic. There was, however, an opening cinematic released for the game a few months prior to the game's original release. It starts with Jak and Daxter meeting up with Torn in the palace. He informs them that there's another precursor egg that's been spotted and some kind of robots are after it. At that moment, Haven City starts being invaded by these robots. One kidnaps Daxter, and Jak chases it, but ends up falling out of the palace. This is where the cutscene ends. It isn't very long and there's no voice acting. The opening text in the game explains that after falling out of the palace, he decides to look for the precursor stone by himself. When he finally finds it, a metalhead bot comes and gets its ass kicked by Jak. As a last resort, it opens a warp gate and sends Jak through the portal. This is where the game starts. I'm not going to go through the entire story. I'll let you experience it for yourself. It's an experience, alright. The cutscenes in this game are an interesting case. For the most part, they are very basic. The voice acting is pretty terrible. Jak says some questionable things.
Where the fuck am I?
And there isn't really anything in the way of animation. I will say though, while they are very basic, some of these scenes are really well shot and look pretty great for what it is. This scene right here is animated so well, and if the game had more of this, it would have been so awesome. Next, let's look at the gameplay. So this does deviate a bit from the Jak 2 formula, but that's okay. Jak 2 deviated heavily from the first game, and that was still great. This game is a 2D platformer with some combat elements. It's also an extremely linear game. I do wish that they kept the exploration from the first two games. That would have been amazing to experience in a 2D adventure. Anyway, it starts with a simple tutorial, then we're into the gameplay. So let's break this down to its core elements. Jak's moveset. Being a 2D platformer, I'm surprised at how much of Jak's moveset they kept. Since it's a PC game, we're gonna have to play with a keyboard, which isn't ideal. We use the left and right arrows to move Jak and the spacebar to jump. Press twice to double jump. If we press the down arrow, we'll do a punch, and if we press it while in the air, we'll do a spin in the air to get some extra distance. Of course, this is the very basics of Jak's original moveset, but I'm surprised at how much they kept, and it actually plays quite well. What did bug me a bit is that Jak isn't centered on screen, he's slightly to the right. This makes it a bit hard to see what's coming up ahead, like this boulder that just appeared out of nowhere. So that's his core moveset. My only complaint with it is the fact that we have to play on a keyboard. It feels really cramped and awkward. On my first playthrough, I used the standard keyboard setup, but on my second, I used a program to map keys to my PS4 controller, which made the experience much better. I mapped the controller to try and get it as close to the controls of the other two games, and it honestly felt pretty awesome. If you're gonna play this, ditch the keyboard. Now, let's look at the platforming and level design. So, Jak feels good to play, which is great. The level design is a bit hit or miss. There are long stretches of gameplay where we're just platforming, which is cool, but sometimes it is a bit rough. This level, for example, it's kinda hard to see where you're supposed to go because of the art style. It's a bit hard to distinguish the background from where you can walk. Situations like this aren't very common, but they are a problem. While exploring the world, we'll often come across these poles that we can swing on, and these bounce pads that will launch us high into the air. These are also nice additions, although I found the poles to be a bit finicky to get to work at times. As well as these throughout the levels, there are also some platforms that collapse or disappear, platforms that move along that we have to keep up with while avoiding obstacles, among a few others. When it comes to the long platforming sections, they usually do a really good job of starting them simple, then slowly introducing new obstacles and challenges. My only problem I have with these sections is some of them are really long and have no checkpoints. For the most part, the game is pretty good with checkpoints, but some of these platforming sections go on for a long time, and having to start them all over again is a bit annoying. We can also turn into light Jak at certain points, which gives us the ability to fly and slow time. The The way we transform is there are areas with light eco coming from the ground, which transforms us, and lasts until this gauge runs out. Lightjack's flight is a bit hard to control. It's very stiff, and I never felt like I had much control over him. I ended up just flying straight to the roof of the levels as I moved to the right. During these sections, there'll often be something like rocks flying into the air that we'll have to navigate. While flying through these, we can use his time slow ability to make it a bit easier to avoid the obstacles. These sections aren't the best. If they made Lightjack's flight a bit smoother and didn't relegate using him to these specific sections, and instead integrated Lightjack into Jak's normal moveset, Lightjack would have been a great addition. Maybe we could have also had some super fast enemies that we would have had to slow down to damage or something like that. So for the most part, the platforming is pretty fun. Jak feels great to play and works well with the platforming challenges the game provides. The Lightjack sections are a bit crap, but there aren't very many of them in the game. Next, let's look at the combat. As well as a basic punch and spin kick in the air, we also have access to Dark Jak. This time we can go dark at any time and for as long as we want, but we need to collect Dark Eco to use his powers. Dark Jak can run faster and hit harder. Instead of punching, he spin kicks, although I'm not sure if this was intended, but you can't spin while moving. To spin as Dark Jak, you need to stand in place and spin. It's kinda annoying. After collecting a certain amount of Dark Eco from enemies, the Dark meter will turn blue, which will let us use the Dark Bomb power. And if we collect more and the meter turns red, we can use the Dark Murder power. Honestly, it's kinda hard to tell when you're able to use the Dark Bomb power, and the game never really explains how Dark Jak works. It tells us how to use the special powers, but doesn't tell us if we need to collect Dark Eco to transform in the first place, or if using Dark Jak drains the collected Dark Eco. It would have been nice if the game informed us of this. Because of this, I never really used Dark Jak very often in my first playthrough, and I almost never used any of his powers. Which is a shame because it could have been an awesome feature, and not needing to fill up the meter just to transform in the first place is a big step up from its implementation in Jak 2. During my second playthrough, I tried to make use of him a bit more and got a better grasp of how he worked. What I also found was that his dark powers don't do any damage to enemies a lot of the time. There were a number of times that I had no ammo and decided to go dark and tried using one of his powers only for the enemies to not even stumble, kill me, and respawn with an empty Dark Eco meter. Needless to say, this was pretty frustrating and I don't even know why it happened. As we progress through the game, we'll acquire two guns, the Shotgun and the Vulcan Fury. Both are pretty useful and are nice additions. The Shotgun is almost like a hybrid of the Scattergun and Blaster from Jak 2, and the Vulcan is pretty much the same as in Jak 2. Another annoyance that doesn't seem to be intentional is sometimes you'll get to a scenario where you run out of ammo, then die, and find out that the game didn't stock you with any ammo, so you'll have to beat these enemies with your fists. This is super frustrating, but what's worse is it only happens sometimes. I don't know if it's only at certain spots or happens at random times, but it's really annoying. It even happened to me during the final boss. Luckily it's a super easy fight, which I'll get to soon, but damn, this is a pretty bad flaw that should have been fixed. Other than that, the guns are pretty fun to use, and I enjoyed their inclusion. I've just gone over Jak's arsenal, so how does it go against the enemies? Well, it's pretty alright. The enemies don't really have much variation. There are these small ones that bite at you, there's these tall ones which come up to you and try to hurt you, and towards the end of the game, there's these robots which will breathe fire. The enemies just typically spawn in groups in front of you, and the only real strategy is to keep a distance and stun lock them with one of your guns. It's a bit shallow, which is a shame because your combat abilities are deep enough that they can be pretty interesting. The combat never really integrates itself with the platforming either. For the most part, the platforming and combat are completely separate from each other. For what it is, the combat is serviceable and there is some fun to be had here. While I'm talking about the combat, let's look at the boss fights. Spoilers ahead for the fights, guys. Skip to here if you don't want to see any of the boss fights. The first boss is a robot in this cave after you get the shotgun. The way the boss works is you have to climb up these platforms, then shoot this rock which will fall on him and stun him. Then you jump down and damage him until he stops being stunned. It's simple enough and it would be fine, but the biggest problem is the difficulty. This is the first boss which isn't very far into the game. Prior to this, the only combat we've had was without any guns. This boss is the first enemy to be fought with a gun. He fires projectiles at you as you're climbing the platforms, and as you're trying to shoot down the rock, he will keep on firing as you're trying to shoot, and his projectiles can have potential to do a lot of damage. Aside from the difficulty, the boss is fine enough. It's the first and only time combat is integrated with platforming, but it is very basic. The next boss is story related, so if you don't want to be spoiled by the fantastic story and want to see me cover the final boss, skip to this time. You're not going to be missing out on much if you do. The second boss is against a giant monster Daxter. This one is very simple, but it's still a bit challenging. Daxter will keep on punching the ground and we have to jump over the shockwaves he creates. After a little, a rock will fall on his head and stun him. As he's stunned, we have to damage him until he wakes up. After he does, a rock will fall on us and we have to try and dodge it. And that's the whole boss. Almost the same as the last one, but a lot easier. Still very basic. The final boss is against the Metalhead Leader. This is the easiest boss in the game. It starts with it shooting some things from these spikes. We just have to jump over them. Then he'll fire some explosive barrels onto the stage. They start at the end of the stage and travel down towards the robot and we have to dodge them. This is the easiest thing though, because if we stay right next to the robot, none of them will damage you. After it's done with the barrels, it'll start emitting smoke. This is when we start damaging it until it stops being stunned. Repeat this until you beat it. You've probably noticed, but all three bosses are essentially the same. Each boss gets easier as the game goes on too, which is super disappointing. I complained about the difficulty of the first boss, but if that was the final boss, that would have been a good final boss. I do wish they had some variation as well, instead of all three of them just needing to wait for them to be stunned. Now let's look at the other stuff. Like any Jak game, there needs to be some added variety, whether it's vehicles or turret missions. This game has a couple vehicle missions, a skateboard grinding sort of mission, and a turret mission. All of these are actually pretty good, although the turret mission is a bit hard because you have to use the mouse for the first and only time. They are fairly short and easy and are a nice pace breaker, not really much more to say. So now that we've looked at all the aspects of the gameplay, let's look at the rest of the game. For the most part, the presentation is fairly decent. Everything is very clean and the art style is pretty alright. Although the design of some areas is a bit ugly and, like I said earlier, it can be a bit hard to navigate. The heads-up display is quite nice and simple. The cutscenes are a bit stiffly animated, but they do get the job done nicely. The menus are okay and easy to navigate. I do have to commend the devs for keeping the loading times out of the game, like the games previous. The music is kinda weird. Some tracks fit the levels well, but some sound like stripped back hip hop songs, which is really odd. The music doesn't loop very well either, and the tracks restart every time you die, which is a bit of a pain. There were a few times where I encountered a glitch or two, like here, I just fell through the stage. Like 3 times. And that stems into what I think my biggest problem with this game is. It didn't have a very long development, it had an extremely low budget, and it was pretty much just one guy working on it. While I think the game turned out okay, I can't see why Naughty Dog couldn't work on this game themselves. The team has many talented people, a big budget, and if the first 2 games are anything to go by, more time to make games. It just boggles the mind even more when the next game in the series, Jak X, was made by Naughty Dog and was on the PS2. And that was a racing spin-off. And it also seems to ignore this game's ending. I guess it was a spin-off, so that's fine, I guess. Honestly, the potential this game had, it really just kinda angers me that it wasn't given the proper treatment. Just why, Naughty Dog? Why? Why?
What? There's no way.
Banished to the wasteland for life.
Don't thank me. I'm only here because you wouldn't last a second without me. The KG have a new leader. We're trying to find out who it is. We're falling!
Over here. Jump. By the precursors.
another storm coming.
You must collect all the tokens. You must roll those lines. Yes, it's the shoulder roll.
So, in conclusion, the game plays pretty well, the platforming is a lot of fun, the combat could use a few improvements, and is an overall pretty good way to spend a few hours. My main issues are the game being a bit rough, and I think a bit longer to develop, and some more people making it to share some insights to its mechanics would have benefited the game a lot better. The story, while not being one of the best stories ever told, its major plot points and its ending are amazing, just see for yourself. Anyway, you should go play this. There's links in the description below.
I'm gonna go play Jak 3 now.